Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about the generational purchasing program, research program that we did last year in 4 different retail locations. And what we have is we have some special guests on board here. And I'm going to switch back so we can see them just in a second right now. And I think we're back, right? Okay, there's the opening screen. This is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to move that down and just go through it. Then we'll do the introduction of people here in a moment. On the call today, we have myself as Executive Director for the Maumee Valley Growers, and I'll be your host today. We have Bridget Behe, consultant, and she will discuss with us some of the results and offer some suggestions of the program research that we did back in May and June. And then we have Tom Wardell, president of the Maumee Valley Growers, who will be asking some questions at the end of the program. And then we will also have Zach Edwards, who's on board right now, chairman of the Education Events Committee, who also will be asking some questions as we go through here. The purpose of the research, the purpose of the grant, is to determine if there are any specific retail promotions or strategies that the growers can do or implement based on last year's retail generational purchasing observations. And we made a bunch of them. Some of them are interesting, some of them are valid, some of them are also predictable. But is there anything special we can come up with to take advantage of the data that we collected? That is the purpose. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's do a quick project wrap up, or recap, I should say. Here's what we did. We observed and recorded retail customer purchases from several point of purchase displays that were located in 4 greenhouse locations. We used, those that participated were 2 cameras located in Black Diamond, 2 in one of their locations, which was the Perrysburg location. Then we had a camera in Bostort's greenhouse, Klotz's, and Wardell's. And we selected a camera so they were not cameras so that they wouldn't get in the way or skew the data. As people made the purchases, it was pretty organic, and we found that of value. So when was this data collected? Originally, we were going to do a couple days a week, but then we soon realized that we're better off just doing it during all open hours, 7 days a week during the 8 weeks of May and June in 2021. That gave us more data, and we pulled in plenty of it. In fact, here's kind of what we found. How are the purchases recorded? A camera was mounted near each display area to record each purchase. 5 cameras in total, 4 greenhouse locations, 5 cameras. Again, two cameras located at the Perrysburg location at Black Diamond. Over 10,000, believe it or not, 7 to 15-second camera events, as they call it, were recorded, yielding about 865 sales, which were captured during the 8-week period. Here's the specific information we gathered. The age group, of course. Other than the age group, we also did male and female. We also had 2 different signages that we tested, and that'll come up later in our discussions. One was what we call an environmental sign, and the other one was either a sales sign or a sale announcing a value if you purchased. There were some times we didn't use any sign at all, too. So the environmental signs, just so you know, would talk about CO2 produced, native plants, the attraction of different insects, et cetera, things that were good for the environment. And of course, sale signs are a reduction of purchase costs for the customer. We recorded the number of purchases. I'm going to say 90%, 95% was a single purchase. Although if there were multiple purchases, we recorded them also, as long as we could see them. We did not record a purchase if the item if the item or the tag was picked up, examined, then set down. That was a no purchase. Okay, that's logical. We notated the store location. We notated the date and week, 1 through 8, and then time and seconds needed to make a purchase or not. The intent was to see if there's any uniqueness or difference between the execution of a purchase from a customer's point of view. And these were the 5 different age groups we dealt with, which was post-millennials, the youngest group, the millennials, which there are 83 million millennials in the United States, making them currently the largest generation in history, followed by Generation X, and you can see the age groups they fit into, which is age 38 to 53, the baby boomers, and one I didn't even know about, which is called the silent generation. And those were the 92, the 73 to 90-year-old age groups. A little bit of detail that you should know about. There were 2 sets of signage in addition to not using signage at all, which we also recorded. We talked about it briefly. Pricing and sales signs. We alternated each week. We used a pricing sign 1 week, pulled it, put another sign in that promoted the environmental informational signs the next week, and so on. We did that back and forth and recorded everything. The signage on the second bullet here, like I mentioned, was rotated. And the mission here was to see if the message influenced the number of purchases or the price tag of each purchase. Data was recorded only from observable purchases, meaning if items were purchased and chosen off screen, they were not included. There were times where I could see somebody pushing an empty cart, go off screen and come back with a plant or 2 in the cart. They obviously intended on making that purchase, but we did not record that because we wanted to see the actual process of noticing a plant, observing it, making a decision, yay or nay. All data was streamed to the cloud for easy access. It was secured by a password to record the findings. This was important to our participants, of course. All observations were made by myself. I was going to split it up with a couple other people, but I decided not to, just so that we had consistency. And I did have the time, and this was a grant paid for function. The use of masks occasionally, because this was right in the middle of COVID, made it difficult sometimes to determine the generational classification. So there are times when it's difficult to determine an age. And when it got close to those breakpoints of the 5 different generational age groups, it was a best guess. And having a mask didn't help things at the time, but you know, we did our best on that. So here are some of the findings and observations we made along the way. We'll have, I believe, 3 slides that will show you some of the things we found that were prevalent, and let's read through them. If the customer picks up the plant or examines the care label to make an evaluation, it generally resulted in a sale. Makes sense, except if they held it for what we consider longer than normal to make that assessment, which the longer they held it, it became more and more likely they would not buy. So there's a sweet spot in there in which they made that purchase. And we're going to talk about that a little later, but it's faster than you think, probably 7 to 14 seconds. Most of them were actually 5 seconds or less. They really knew what they were looking for. Let's move on. If a customer picked up a plant or care label and did not buy, it was considered a no purchase. Makes sense. They stopped, they looked at it, but did not purchase, so it was not recorded. Number 3, if both the male and female shopped together, it was almost always the female buying the plant. Not a real surprise there. The use of the face mask, as I mentioned earlier, made it difficult sometimes to distinguish the age group in which they would fit, especially when these two age groups were contiguous with each other. So again, best guess. Slide 2 of 3. The floral displays that had some empty spaces or were sparser seemed to imply to the buyer that the remaining items had more significant value and were popular choices, popular purchases. We all try to keep our displays full, but maybe there's something to be said about having the impression that purchases were made, and maybe this is a good place to look and make a buy because other customers have already justified it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then number 6, occasionally customers look to the back of the display, which I found kind of interesting, as they would maneuver to the back of the display to hunt for that nicer plant, thinking no buyer discovered it yet. The best goods were in the back, they were undiscovered. But in reality, the grower most often put their best products in the front. So just a little interest in psychology. Clarification. The time in seconds to make multiple purchases represented the total purchase transaction. Let me explain. If 2 items were purchased at 7 seconds for one item and then another 3 seconds for the other, I recorded the 2 purchases at 10 seconds when they placed it in the cart. So the average was obviously 5. The number 8, the locations that we have, 99.9% of our shoppers were white. Why? I'm guessing it's simply the demographics. They were all located in suburban locations. And not really rural, but we had a couple in the Bowling Green area, which kind of is rural, but it's just a small town. So that would explain that. Our final slide here of findings is kids do make a difference. If they are confined to a wagon or a cart, it generally took slightly longer for a purchase or a no purchase decision. If the children were not confined and free to roam around or walk around or hang on the side of the cart, definitely a quicker decision was made by about half the time. So that's an interesting observation. Maybe, and we are going to talk about that. Is it worthwhile to consider keeping the kids busy in a play area so that the shopper, the parents, the mother perhaps, can have a little more time with an eye shot to make some purchases and not feel rushed all the time. Number 10, only purchases or no purchases were recorded that were observed on camera entirety. Spoke about that earlier. If we didn't see it happen from the beginning to the end, we did not record it. And of course, we know there were purchases in addition to that. There were many sales not recorded, even though they were made, but they were selected off camera. But we couldn't get enough information on that, especially the amount of time it took for them to look at it, purchase it, or not purchase it. Number 11, as the season progressed into June, shoppers became more choosy, or seemingly they became more choosy, because they were looking for specific replacements that may have died that they purchased in the past, or they needed more of the same kind of plants. So that should affect the way you promote in June. Is when one of your one of your employees see a customer in June, they're more likely to look for replacements with something in mind. And so approaching them probably would be very helpful as they say, you know, I bought XYZ in May. It's doing great, but I need 2 or 3 more, or 1 or 2 passed away. 1 or 2 died. I need to replace them. So in June, that might become a strategy for the employees to approach a customer with. So as I said earlier, it's kind of hard to believe, but we did film more than 10,000 7 to 15 second camera events. We actually wrote down 867 sales that were captured during this 8-week period. Most of the purchases were done during the 7 to 15 second period, but quite frankly, most of those were done closer to the 7 second. So people seem to spot something they like, they would approach it, look at it and buy it, or look at 2 or 3 other items and buy the best of the bunch if there was any distinguishing difference. So number 13, the final one, there were a few unusually long purchase times. I'm talking 2 or 3 minutes. And those were also notated. They were also recorded in that 7 time second average, but ideally they probably should have been tossed for this recording aspect because they were so long. And the long purchases were really done at 2 ends of the age groups. The first age group we'll call 20-ish in age, 15 to 20, 15 to 22. They took more time to read the care labels because probably this is something kind of new to them, and they wanted to know, will this survive? Does it require more light? What's the watering conditions, etc. And the other group was the absolute opposite. I would say age 70, 75 or older, where they knew exactly what they're looking for. Obviously, they had some experience, but they really studied the plant and really decided, do I want to spend X amount of money on this plant and take it home? So those were the findings. One thing I should also add, I thought I had it in here, I didn't, but as most of the purchases were clearly done by who we suspected, females, kind of in the age group of 45 to 60. Not all, but in that age group. Almost always, if the male was there for the purchase, he was pushing the cart around and not making any input as to whether they should buy or not. Found that kind of amusing. That was pretty consistent, by the way. So I'm going to get off the slides. I'm going to turn it over to Bridget, and we can do a little bit of discussion on some recommendations, and this will lead into some questions that we'll have. So Bridget, let me turn it over to you.
Okay.
You want to give a little background about yourself? I probably should have did a little more in that, but go for it.
Sure, Joe, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my perspectives as a volunteer consultant on what I think is probably a really fascinating retail study. So I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I study why and how people buy plants, horticultural marketing. And so I teach classes on marketing and management and have done many consumer studies. And I really commend the Maumee Valley growers and you for getting this grant and undertaking this real life in the retail garden center study, because there just simply aren't that many of them out there. Excuse me. So that's a big deal right off the bat. You kind of knew going into this that the demographics were going to matter, and I think that hypothesis was confirmed. Kind of along with that, you talked a little bit about the timing, the time that it took for some different age groups to make a purchase, and that's an important consideration. So we've seen this in our lab studies using the high-tech eye tracking glasses. We do know that it's just about 5 seconds. Your average was around 7, ours in the lab is around 5, to make a purchase decision. And I think that sometimes catches some people off guard, because as growers, we think, wow, everybody's looking at everything, and they're not. They pretty quickly find either something they love or they just dismiss it outright. And so you do get that kind of, I call it the love it or hate it, that U-shaped curve. So you talked about the purchase dimensions and what you saw for the purchase, but I think it's equally important for grower retailers to understand there were a lot of people who just very quickly looked and passed it by. So that's a very important dimension of some of the things that you found. You talked a little bit about the empty shelf, and I kind of call it the empty shelf syndrome, where if you have a lot of choices, like, let's put you in the supermarket, you have a lot of choices of the same thing, and let's say you're not terribly brand loyal, you're open to trying something new. Sometimes when we see, well, this row is full and this row is full, but boy, there's only 1 or 2 of these left, what's the tendency to think there? Ah, that must be a good one, because there aren't very many of that choice left. And so that empty shelf syndrome, not always, but sometimes can sway our decision to think that's a good product, I'm going to get. Now, if it's the last one, it doesn't work that way. But if there are a few left, generally that can influence it. And another phenomenon that we found, I worked with a colleague, and she's a professor of retailing, in a lab study, or excuse me, in a retail study we did a couple years ago, right before the pandemic hit. We found that when people would walk around with a cart that had a really attractive plant in it, we could get people, customers, to look at that cart. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility. If you have something really cool that's a really high price point, get one of your salespeople who's not in uniform to walk around with that cart for a little while, and you might drive some more sales that way. The signage is a very big deal. And I think a lot of times we believe that people buy pretty much on price. And while I will argue there's a substantial segment who do that, I think generally we turn more people off, potential customers, when we have a sign that shows the price in very large typeface versus some of those environmental benefits that some of the stores displayed during some of the study. You know, the quickest way to turn them off, I think, is a big high price. And I think the quickest way to bring them in a little closer is to give them some of the benefits. This plant attracts pollinators. It's drought tolerant. It will flower under some of the hottest summer conditions in northern Ohio. When we talk about some of those benefits, we can bring people in closer. And we're not talking a half hour, as you showed. We're talking a few seconds. That kind of signage is going to bring them a little bit closer. They can maybe look at that tag, see if that fits their site, and then they say, okay, wow, that will attract pollinators. Wow, this has a fragrance. This is very floriferous, or is going to flower all season long. Those are the kind of benefits that we're going to bring people in closer with. And then the kids, this is always a real challenge. And Paco Underhill wrote a book. He's got, I think it's the second or third edition out now, called The Science of Shopping. And he's actually measured how the impact that children have in a lot of different shopping situations. And it's always the fastest decision is when the parents are shopping with the child. The intermediate time is a woman shopping with a man, and guess where we get the most time is a female shopping with a female companion, because they're going to take the time and discuss and talk about and enjoy that shopping experience. So can we buy the parents a little bit of time? Anything we could do to safely engage those kids can buy parents even a couple more seconds. Crayons and individual coloring sheets is something that I've seen many places do. You know, when we get into kind of play equipment, and, you know, parents are a little reluctant to wander too far from that. But if we can engage the kids even for a short period of time, we can buy the parents just a little bit longer. So there are a lot of really good things that I think the industry can learn from your study. And if nothing else, I'm hoping that retailers see that doing consumer research is not beyond their capability or not beyond something they can do themselves. Now, I know you spend a lot of time looking at those videos. And in a non-pandemic situation, I think it would have been easier without the masks. But, you know, we have security cameras up in a lot of places, and we're not using these images in any other way except for our own research purposes. But when you're testing different signage, when you're testing different styles of display, I think one of the best outcomes of your study is to show grower retailers that they can do this research and learn from it, because you don't have to decode that data right away. You don't have to look at that data the next day. You pulled it down from the cloud and went back to it. And when retailers have a slower period of time, I just think it's a really great example of a focused study that used technology. We didn't have, your time was a lot, but we didn't use a lot of boots on the ground, so to speak, when the retailers were so busy. So hopefully in the future, the retailers will see changing signs is a great thing. There are, we've got to approach people with different kinds of information depending on their level of expertise. And in our study too, we found those tags to be supremely important, because if you can get them close enough to touch that plant, and they get a little bit of information, not too much. Remember that U-shaped curve. If we can get them a little bit closer, a lot of times they do end up with that in the cart. So I'll just pause there and see what questions Tom and Zach have, or what comments, Joe, you want to make on some of these potential recommendations.
Yeah, we can bring the other two in right now, and we'll keep the screen so that everyone can be seen as they ask their questions. Yeah, the key is there was a lot of data collected, and we can pass it out at our retail roundtable when we have it in February. Or I could send it out earlier if we end up doing it as a Zoom meeting, which is probably likely, and they can make that reference, including this PowerPoint presentation. So my question is, we went through all the trouble of gathering the data. What are some reasons, or how are some ways we can capitalize on that? Because a lot of these things were logical. Some of the things were kind of entertaining and amusing. And what's the best thing we can do to make this, to close off the research project and really apply some of the lessons learned.
Well, I think especially coming into this spring 22 season, thinking about changes to signage and trying to quantify some of those impacts. You talked about having one week having some environmental benefits and another week not having that. To kind of drive that point home, could you have two of pretty similar displays in the same retail outlet, one with the environmental sign and one with the price sign, and see where you sell more plant material from? Could you get a group of stores who maybe don't use some of those benefit signage and another group that do, and see what the percent increases week over week? The idea being, if one group of stores focused on the price and another group of stores focused on the environmental benefits, my hypothesis would be you're going to see a greater lift in sales where you talk about those environmental benefits. And then two, I think, could you entice more of your retailer growers to continue this in other ways? Are there other aspects that they would like to discover? Do you want to put a camera around the foliage plants versus the bedding plants? Do you want to see what some of the age group differences are for the herbs versus the fruits, maybe, or maybe there's a difference there? Do you want to construct some displays around color and maybe use the Pantone color of the year and see if that would attract more people and more sales versus having some of those perennial plants or annuals, whatever you're going to feature, having those intermingled with other annuals or other perennials? I mean, there's both the process. Using those cameras was just incredibly smart use of technology. And then there are other ways you can do that. And then looking at these results and saying, wow, I want to learn a little bit more about this, that, or the other thing.
Well, comparing, one thing we do know is color makes a difference. The eye is attracted to the color, and people seem to gravitate more towards a colorful display than a non-colorful one. We also found out for the higher priced items, say $50 to $75 per pot and greater, we still needed that color to bring people over there to evaluate that higher priced item. So having something that was maybe $10 to $15 but had beautiful color was a great idea. And then it gave people a choice. How about it, guys? Why don't you unmute your microphone? And I know you've been thinking about some of these things, and you of course both have a lot of experience. Do you have any comments? And this would be both to Tom or Zach.
I guess one of the questions I had when we were talking about the signage, did you happen to evaluate, or could you see, like, was it a certain age group that would maybe be gravitated more towards the environmental signs? We hear more that millennials are interested in the oxygen of the plants put out in their house, want their house to be healthier. Would they be more? Could you see anything, a difference in that, where the younger people read the signs more when it was environmental versus the older people that said, oh, actually, we don't really care?
Bridget, do you have any experience on that?
I think you're right. I didn't look at any of this data to see if that was true, but I think we have evidence from other studies that more millennials respond to that environmental benefit. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't influence purchases of Gen X, Gen Y, and boomers, because they're interested in the environment too. But for some of those age cohorts, it's to a lesser extent.
Do you think that looking at the data we already have from another angle and breaking it down into different buckets than Joe already has, do you think it would be worth it to look at the week that the environmental sign was out versus the week that the price was out, and see if, even if it's just by location, if one of them saw an increase in sales, if it's essentially the same plants and the same products at the same display, but price is emphasized versus the environmental benefits. I mean, that would, I think, give you a real actionable, results, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think that is really the way to go. And that was kind of what I was trying to encourage when I was talking about how, relatively speaking, I mean, it is someone's time to go through this. But as retailers change or manipulate different aspects of their displays, you can learn a lot from those videos, and even price changes. You can look, if you have a good point of sale system, you could look at the impact of, obviously weather's going to play a role. But if you have a sign one week and pretty similar weather the next week, but you change it to the price sign, you can make some of those comparisons. And I think that's a great thing to do.
Do
Well,
you think
we have that data? So I made a note here, Zach, that what I'll do is look over that data, compare the sales or the numbers of purchases with the environmental signs posted, or the values at, or value signs or sales signs posted, and also the age group. I think that'll clue us in real good. That's a really good suggestion.
And do you think contextualizing the weather during those stretches as well would be, I know I don't have the dates right in front of me, and I can't remember exactly when we did the install, but I know May started off very cold after March and April had been above average in temperature. And then we normalized, but even just a rainy day, you hate to ever take one day, I think, is too much data. But if there was a trend of rain weather versus drier weather, I mean, I think I know the results, but I'd be curious to see if people take more time when it's rainy because it's less crowded and there's less competition for plants, et cetera.
I think that's a great idea. And I have not seen any in the literature that I'm familiar with, I haven't seen anything done like that. So that's a great idea.
Okay.
One of the things, Joe, you mentioned and stuff is how people, if they saw it, they liked it, it's almost an impulse buy, that they're going to pick it up and go with it without even thinking about it. Is that really something we need to work harder at? And I mean, it's almost, if you can rush people a little bit and they see something that catches their eye, they're going to pick it up and buy it without thinking about it. I really don't know if I like this that much. And it's almost, we want to hurry them through. And so I guess it's a little different when they had their kids there. Would that rush them into buying something a little bit faster than giving them time to think it over? And I guess I wonder how those sales would correlate when they're in a hurry coming through here. They're going to buy what they want to, what they see they like right off the bat, and then get out.
Well, this may be of no surprise, but the guys that made purchases you just described, they knew what they wanted, they bought it, they left. They didn't even look at the tag. They were on a mission. So your better question is probably directed towards the woman purchaser. So I'll turn that over to Bridget to help us out on that one.
Well, I think there's a couple things at work here, and we know from other research that first 25, 50 feet, that landing space, people are pretty oblivious to a lot that is right there because they're looking ahead. And if you think about it, when you're walking into the grocery store, you're walking into just about any kind of store, I would argue there's probably not a whole lot at the front of that store that you actually saw because you're focused on, okay, where am I going to go or what direction am I going to take? And to help the parent who doesn't have time and to make the decision faster, some of those key aisleways, some of those key end caps, that's where we need to have a lot of the impulse items, because if they're going to have a limited amount of time, we want that impulse purchase to happen past that landing strip, but certainly not towards the back of the store. Now, having said that, for the individual who has more time, can we give them a vista or a view, something to see down the way that attracts my attention and draws me back there? And that's where I see a very effective use of colorful plant material, obviously, but things that move. So having flags or pinwheels or anything, because our eye is trained to look at that movement. And is that something that's going to hurt me? Kind of the fight or flight response. And then we go, oh, that's a beautiful flag. Oh, wow, that's a really cool fountain. That's decorated very nicely. Maybe I see the water spouting or spraying. And so that visual kind of attracts me back there. So knowing we've got both kinds of customers on any given day of the week, we kind of need to merchandise for both and have some of those impulse things just past the landing strip, but also think about some of those longer vistas to get more eyeball time, get people to go through kind of the sub aisles to give them more eyeball time on those other plants.
I think you're making a really good point. Out of the 5 cameras, 3 of them were located in aisles. And I saw a lot of people just, their mission was to get through the aisle. And they look and they look and they move. 2 out of the 5 locations had what you just described, a display area where people looked off in a distance and they could go, oh, what's over there? And then they had plenty of space either in front or around it in its entirety to, once they approached it, they could say, okay, what do we have here? But sometimes when you work in an aisle, although you got to be close to plant to purchase it, they're not seeing it, they're walking by. So that's an interesting comment on there. I like that idea about giving some space around the display so it kind of draws the eye over there.
One way to help facilitate some of that, and this would be another very good experiment for this spring, we tend to put side aisles very perpendicular to the main aisle. And what that causes us to do is we must turn our head a full 90 degrees to be able to see either way. Think about maybe making that angle slightly less acute, more like a chevron or an arrow, kind of pointing away, because then we don't have to turn our head as much. And we might glance up here and say, oh, that's something very interesting. So maybe if there's a space in the retail outlet this spring to go from perpendicular to more of a gentle angle, more like a chevron or an arrow pointing away from the main aisle, people will not have to turn their head as much, and yet we can get a little more eyeball time on some of these side aisles. But certainly parents with children, if these aisles are not, if the kids are in a cart or a wagon, we got to think about what's that paving material. But there is some good science about this perpendicular versus the chevron that can help get a few more eyeballs and feet down those aisles.
The other thing I saw signage everywhere, but most of the signage is lower. There's some signs out, but lower within the plants themselves. Like when you go to supermarket, as you described, at least they put signage up and they say what's in that aisle. They list the items by type or whatever. I don't think any of the growers that I remember were doing that. I could be wrong, but if I'm looking for something, annuals, perennials, nursery stock, whatever, if I had those items out there, it might direct me better into the area I'm looking for, instead of running down an aisle and not seeing anything maybe.
Yeah, those can be helpful as long as people know what they're looking for. We might have to say foliage plants and put an example of a monstera on there, or say annual plants and put a begonia or a petunia or something on there, so that people will say,
Yeah.
oh, that's what that is.
Okay.
So did you happen to have any percentage of just men that came in the shops?
You broke up. Ask the question again.
Did you happen to get any percentages on just men that were shopping versus women or the combination?
I have that information. I could calculate that pretty easily. It
Okay.
wasn't a high number, of course, but 10-15%, maybe 10.
We're seeing that gender gap closing, especially among the younger age cohorts. It wouldn't surprise me at all that when Joe looks at that data, that the men who are shopping by themselves probably are closer to millennials than further away. And so I think that's a real positive. But having said that, we're so used to having marketing messages that appeal mainly to women, we might have to think about some of those changes. And again, here's where those cameras can come in really handy. If we put a certain type of sign around the tomatoes, are we going to attract more male buyers who are there by themselves? Or if we put a different type of benefit near another kind of plant, are we going to attract a different type of buyer?
Do you think it's safe to say that all purchases that were reported, the vast majority of them included somebody with a shopping cart?
What do you mean hoarded?
Included,
Oh,
had a
included.
shopping cart with it, that they were pushing the cart.
Or did you
Yeah.
notice, I mean, I don't know if it'd be easy to tell this information. Did you see people having to leave the area because they didn't have a cart and had to come back with one?
Yes, that I definitely saw, and I talked with one or two of our growers about that, to provide access to a cart nearby, especially for the bigger, higher priced items that were heavier. Absolutely. That wouldn't
Okay.
be a bad idea, just to keep them around the store.
No, that's something that we found is useful, that you're saving a lot of time and hassle and maybe even making the decision just that much easier if the cart's right there.
Yeah.
It can tip you over the edge.
Because it saves them time, and a lot of people don't want to walk back to the entrance of the store and hope that there's a cart there for them.
Exactly.
I can't think of anything else to ask right now.
I'm looking at my notes. I think we covered just about everything that I had written down.
Okay, well, I'll take some notes on this with some of the suggestions we had. I also will follow up on some of these suggestions, good suggestions. So to put it to a close, let's go back to Bridget, and why don't you tie this all together and we'll conclude.
Well, it's just very exciting. And again, I applaud the Maumee Valley growers for taking the initiative to get the grant and to do this, what I consider to be pretty groundbreaking research. And I hope that some change, that whether they participated in the study or not, that they'll realize some of the impact and adopt some of these changes and try using a camera to help evaluate, because it's great technology. It was relatively inexpensive, Joe, to get those cameras, and they operated fairly well.
Yeah.
The big investment is time, but we do have time at other points in the year. So, great job, and just keep up the good work. And hopefully the changes you make this year will help you generate even more profit.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating. When we play this video at the Retail Roundtable, if more questions and concerns come up, Bridget, I'll get back to you and I'll share those with you.
Happy to help.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a great day today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.